I walked into my office on a Monday morning and found my keycard didn't work. Just a red light flashing back at me. After 17 years of walking through that same glass door, the system had decided I was nobody. A security guard stepped closer, radio in hand. He didn't say anything, just waited. That was my first clue. Something had shifted overnight. When I finally got upstairs, Daniel, my boss, was waiting. He didn't even invite me to sit. He just leaned back in his chair and said the words flatly, like he was reading a weather report. "Jake, after careful review, we're eliminating your position. Effective immediately. HR will handle the details." Beside him, Vanessa from HR avoided my eyes. It wasn't a conversation. It was an execution. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I didn't demand a reason. I just nodded once and said the only words that fit. "I understand." Then I turned, walked out, and closed the door behind me. No anger. No scene. Just silence. Inside, though, I could feel something colder rising. My name is Jake Wilson. I'm 54 years old. For almost 2 decades, I'd been the backbone of Meridian Technologies in Columbus, Ohio. From dial-up days to full cloud migration, I was the guy who made things work. 3 CEOs had come and gone, but I remained. I trained every new hire. I documented every system. I carried the institutional memory no one else bothered to protect. And just like that, they threw me away over a rumor I never even got to hear. A baseless concern, Daniel called it. As if that explained anything. I walked back to my desk. My team kept their heads down, pretending not to watch. They were kids, mostly. Bright, talented, but green. None of them knew the older architecture, the custom tools I'd built, or the admin credentials buried 3 layers deep in every system. Without me, they were flying blind. And the executives didn't even realize it. I packed my things methodically. The family photo. The cactus that somehow survived fluorescent light for 17 years. The coffee mug my son made in high school ceramics class. I moved slowly, deliberately, so I could see who dared to meet my eyes. Almost no one did. Except Bethany, from marketing. She stopped at my desk, face pale, voice tight with anger. "Jake, this is insane. You practically built this place." I gave her the same answer I'd given Daniel. Companies change direction. But inside, I knew better. This wasn't about strategy. This wasn't about the future. This was about me. Someone had wanted me gone, and Daniel had pulled the trigger. As I walked out with my box under my arm, Daniel stepped into the hall to watch. No handshake. No goodbye. Just surveillance, making sure I was really gone. I gave him nothing. No words. No look. Just silence. In the parking lot, I sat in my car and looked up at the 12-story building that had been my second home. 17 years of loyalty. 17 years of quiet, meticulous work. 17 years of protecting systems no one else even understood. And they thought it ended here. They were wrong. Because I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't pleaded. I hadn't threatened. I just nodded, walked out, and waited. And while they thought they'd buried me, they didn't realize I'd been preparing for this moment all along. 3 weeks later, the company that fired me collapsed. I spent that first night in silence. My wife Andrea asked what had happened, but I only said, "Changes at work." She didn't press. After 19 years of marriage, she knew I spoke less when I was most focused. The truth was, I had seen this storm forming months before. Small things at first. My permissions quietly reduced in our systems, meetings held without me, project notes passed around that somehow skipped my inbox. At the time, I didn't push back. Instead, I watched. And I documented. For 17 years, my reputation at Meridian was built on one thing: precision. I recorded everything. Every access log, every code deployment, every financial approval connected to my systems. Not because I didn't trust people, but because that was my job, protecting the structure, ensuring accountability. What they didn't realize was that I had kept personal backups too. Nothing illegal, nothing stolen. Just data streams, logs, and audit trails that the legal team had once asked me to safeguard off-site in case of emergencies. They had long forgotten. I had not. So when Daniel fired me without explanation, I knew this wasn't just about some rumor. It was a cover move. A chess piece knocked off the board to clear space for something larger. The next morning, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my home office desk. Inside was a small collection of encrypted drives. I plugged one into my personal laptop and began to review. Patterns emerged almost immediately. Payments authorized to a vendor I'd never seen before, Apex Solutions Group. At first, the amounts were small, easy to overlook in a company processing millions a month. But they had grown steadily. Each invoice approved under CFO Brian Wilcox. Each one signed off with no supporting documentation. I dug deeper, cross-checking the company registration. Apex was registered at a UPS store. The listed owner was Thomas Wilcox, Brian's brother-in-law. The scheme was as old as corporate fraud itself. Inflate vendor payments, funnel excess cash into a shell company, and bury the evidence under layers of consulting services. I leaned back in my chair. This was why I'd been removed. They needed the one man who could connect the dots out of the picture. Daniel, the boss who fired me, was in on it too. His fingerprints were all over the system modifications that stripped my access. I made notes, cataloged files, saved duplicates. Each piece was another nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. That evening, Andrea came into the office and placed a cup of coffee by my elbow. She asked if I was okay. I nodded. Just some work to finish. She didn't ask more. She trusted my silence. By midnight, I had built the beginnings of a map. A timeline of payments, approvals, and access requests. It was enough to raise questions, but not yet enough to crush them. I needed more. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, staring out at the quiet street. The anger was gone. What remained was colder, sharper. They thought they had silenced me. They thought I would vanish quietly into unemployment. They were wrong. I wasn't planning to shout. I wasn't planning to threaten. My revenge would be quiet, methodical, precise, and it had already begun. The morning after my discovery, I sat in my kitchen with black coffee, staring at my laptop screen. No alarm clock, no commute, no deadlines. Just silence and the weight of 17 years of loyalty discarded. But underneath that silence, gears were already turning. I thought about the board of directors. Most of them didn't know me by name. To them, I was just another IT guy, the one who kept systems running while they talked strategy in corner offices. But I knew their habits. I had logged their access patterns, monitored their digital signatures, tracked their approvals during past audits. I knew which ones paid attention and which ones rubber-stamped everything. And I knew exactly how to get their attention without ever stepping inside the building again. I began drafting an anonymous email. Not an accusation. Not a rant from a bitter former employee. Just a breadcrumb trail. Enough detail to make it credible, vague enough to spark panic. The subject line read, "Financial irregularities, immediate review needed." But before sending, I tested the waters. At 9:15 a.m., I sent the first message directly to Daniel, my former boss. A clean summary of Apex Solutions Group, minus the family connection. Just numbers, invoices, and suspicious vendor details. I included enough to make him sweat. By 9:45, my phone rang. Daniel's number. I let it go to voicemail. His message was clipped, strained. "Jake, we need to discuss your email immediately. Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I drove to a quiet coffee shop and watched my inbox. At 10:30, another message appeared. This one from HR. "Mr. Wilson, we've received concerning communication from you that potentially violates your separation agreement. Please cease all contact with Meridian employees." The legal threat was predictable, almost scripted. What they didn't realize was I had never signed any separation agreement. They had rushed me out so fast, they skipped the paperwork. I leaned back in my chair, watching the steam curl from my cup. The panic had begun. That afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Brian Wilcox, the CFO. His voice was calm, practiced. "We should talk about your concerns," he said. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." I didn't respond right away. Silence stretched between us. Then I asked one question. "Is that what you call siphoning millions through a UPS box?" The pause on the other end was telling. Then he offered what men like him always offer. Severance. References. Generosity cloaked as bribery. I hung up without a word. By nightfall, I had 3 missed calls, 2 emails offering me enhanced severance, and 1 uninvited visitor. Andrea told me a man in an expensive suit had come by the house while I was out. He left no card, just a message. Urgent. Jason Phillips. The consultant Daniel had brought in months earlier. They weren't circling anymore. They were scrambling. And the quiet man they had underestimated was holding all the pieces. I closed the blinds, checked the locks, and powered down my phone. The first phase was complete. I had rattled the cage. Now it was time to make them show their hand. The next move would be mine. Thursday morning, I woke before dawn. Andrea was still asleep, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I made coffee and opened the encrypted drive again. I wasn't finished digging. If Daniel, Brian, and Phillips thought they could buy me off with severance, they hadn't understood the kind of man I was. By noon, I had uncovered a second shell company. Different name, same playbook. This one was called Lakeside Business Solutions. The registration led to a virtual office and a CEO named Patricia Wilcox, Brian's wife. The fraud wasn't a one-time scheme. It was a system. Over 3 years, they had quietly funneled more than $4 million out of Meridian through family-controlled fronts. I printed the records, organized them into a clean timeline, and stored duplicates on multiple drives. Years of experience had taught me redundancy. If they thought they could erase me, they didn't realize I'd already built tripwires in places they could never reach. That afternoon, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Robert Chun, a board member who had once worked closely with me during a security overhaul. Unlike the others, he asked questions. He read reports. He noticed details. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much corporate theater. I told him I needed 15 minutes of his time. No job offer. No revenge story. Just facts. We met in a park 3 miles from headquarters, away from cameras and conference rooms. I handed him a sealed envelope with a printed summary and a flash drive. He didn't open it right away. He studied me instead. Why come to me, he asked. Because you actually listen, I said. You're the only one I've seen challenge the numbers. He nodded slowly, slipped the envelope into his briefcase, and promised to review it before the next finance committee meeting. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. What do you want out of this, Jake? Money? Your job back? I shook my head. I don't want a dime. I want the truth in the right hands. That's it. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. If this checks out, it'll be ugly. Then let it be ugly, I said. When I left the park, I felt lighter. Not relieved, focused. The pieces were finally aligned. That night, as Andrea and I ate dinner in silence, my phone buzzed with messages from unknown numbers. Missed calls from Daniel. Another offer from HR. And one text from an unlisted number that read, "Stop this now." I set the phone face down on the table and continued eating. They still believed they were in control. They thought intimidation, money, or threats could pull me back in line. But they hadn't understood the most dangerous part of silence. It doesn't mean surrender. It means I've already chosen the battlefield. Friday morning arrived clear and cold. I didn't go to the office. I wasn't invited anymore. Instead, I sat on my porch with coffee and waited for the clock to strike 8. The board's emergency finance session was scheduled for 9. My plan had already been set in motion. The night before, I'd used a dormant test account buried in Meridian's email server. Years ago, I had created it for penetration testing, a shadow domain that mirrored internal addresses but sat just outside the company directory. They had forgotten it existed. I hadn't. Using it, I scheduled a message to every board member with one simple subject line. Before you approve Q2 bonuses, read this. Attached was the full report, spreadsheets, business registrations, timelines, and access logs. Enough evidence to choke any attempt at dismissal. At 8:17 a.m., my phone began to buzz. Calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Assistants, probably, scrambling to track me down. I ignored them all. By 9 o'clock, I knew the envelope I'd handed Robert Chun would no longer be the only warning. The fire was spreading inside the boardroom. At 9:32, I received a message from Stephen, a junior analyst I'd mentored. Police are here. Wilcox and Daniel in conference rooms. Phillips looks sick. What did you do? I didn't answer. Silence was safer, for both of us. By 10 o'clock, the company's general counsel finally called. Her voice was steady, professional, but the edge of urgency bled through. She asked me to come in, said they needed to discuss the information I'd provided. I told her everything she needed was already in the report, backed up in multiple secure locations. If anything happened to me or my family, copies would reach regulators and news outlets. Silence stretched on the line before she finally conceded. The board is taking this very seriously, she said. By lunch, the first leaks had hit the local business press. Headlines spoke of financial irregularities and executive leave pending investigation. No names yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. That afternoon, Robertson called. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's a bloodbath," he said. "Brian confessed when confronted with your evidence. He's trying to cut a deal, blaming Daniel. Daniel's denying everything. Phillips claims ignorance. No one's buying it." I didn't say much, just listened. Then Robert added something I hadn't expected. "The board wants to talk to you. About coming back. Not just to your old role. They're creating a new position. Chief Security Officer. Reporting directly to us." I didn't answer right away. The thought of returning to the same building that had thrown me out 3 weeks ago was bitter, but the leverage I now held was undeniable. That night, as Andrea and I sat together in the quiet of our living room, she asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want to do?" I stared out the window into the dark, and for the first time since Daniel had fired me, I allowed myself a small smile. The revenge part was over. Now it was time to decide whether I wanted to rebuild or walk away forever. Monday morning, I walked into Meridian's headquarters wearing a suit I hadn't needed in years. The security guard at the front desk did a double take before printing me a visitor badge. "Welcome back, Mr. Wilson," he said with a respect I hadn't seen before. 17 years of quiet loyalty had earned me nothing. 3 weeks of silence had changed everything. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt strange. I had never belonged up there. My world had been servers, log files, and code repositories buried in the lower levels. Now I was expected in the boardroom. 10 directors sat around a polished oak table when I entered. Robertson gave me the slightest nod. The interim CEO, previously the COO, looked uncomfortable as she began. "Mr. Wilson, thank you for coming. The situation you've exposed is unprecedented. The forensic team has identified more than $5 million diverted through fraudulent vendors. Criminal charges are being prepared." I didn't respond. I let the silence do the work. Robert cleared his throat. "Jake, the board has unanimously voted to create a new position. Chief Information Security Officer. Full authority, reporting directly to us. We'd like you to take it." I placed a folder on the table and slid it across. "Inside are my conditions," I said. "Non-negotiable." The CEO opened it and frowned as she read. "Full audit authority across all departments. Independent budget. Veto power on financial technology decisions." I nodded once. "This is unusual," she said carefully. "So was stealing $5 million under your watch," I replied. The room went quiet. Not a single director argued. They understood the stakes. "You have until noon," I added, standing. "I have other offers." I left them with that silence and rode the elevator back down. Andrea was waiting outside in the car. She asked how it went. I told her they'd call. At 11:47, my phone rang. Robert's voice was steady. "They've accepted every condition." That afternoon, I signed the papers. By the end of the week, the announcement went public. The same company that had thrown me out was now presenting me as the architect of its rebirth. Executives whispered my name with caution. Employees who once avoided my eyes now nodded with quiet respect. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't a speech or a confrontation. It was leverage, delivered in silence. Months later, I stood in my new corner office, overlooking the Columbus skyline. I reviewed fresh security protocols for the coming quarter while headlines splashed news of indictments. Brian Wilcox had pled guilty, trading years of freedom for a lighter sentence. Daniel was still fighting charges. Phillips had fled to Brazil but was being extradited. The company had survived, but not unchanged. Systems were stronger, oversight tighter. And at the center of it all was the man they once thought disposable. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't begged. I hadn't even raised my voice. I'd simply waited. And when the moment came, I acted, quietly, methodically, without mercy. The collapse had been theirs. The silence was mine. 6 months into the new role, I had stopped thinking of myself as the man they discarded. Now I was the man they feared. Every department head knew my name. Every executive learned quickly that budgets and approvals no longer passed without my eyes on them. My silence in meetings carried more weight than their speeches. Andrea noticed the change in me. At dinner one evening, she said I seemed lighter, more focused. I told her the truth. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something colder. Satisfaction. For years, I had been invisible. Now, invisibility had become my weapon. But victory wasn't clean. With every report I signed, every audit I approved, I thought about the cost. 17 years of loyalty had been erased in a single meeting. Not because of incompetence, not because of failure, but because of greed. Men like Daniel and Brian had gambled that I would go quietly. They had been half right. I had left without a word. But I hadn't gone quietly at all. The irony was that my rise came not through ambition, but through their betrayal. Without their fraud, I would still be in a windowless office 2 floors down, solving problems no one noticed. Betrayal had turned into opportunity. Silence had turned into power. I began building a team of my own. People who understood that security wasn't just firewalls and passwords. It was vigilance, the kind that didn't need applause. I promoted Steven, the young analyst who once texted me in panic, to lead operations. He had talent, and more importantly, he had learned to observe without rushing to speak. Together, we uncovered more than anyone expected. Old contracts padded with unnecessary fees. Procurement processes riddled with favoritism. Vendor relationships that had gone unquestioned for years. None of it reached the scale of the Wilcox fraud, but it was wrought all the same. Quietly, methodically, I cut it out. Still, there were moments when I wondered if returning had been the right choice. One afternoon, as I reviewed reports, Robert Chin stopped by my office. He told me the board was impressed. Then he asked something unexpected. "Did you plan this all along, Jake? Did you let them underestimate you just so you could take the throne?" I said nothing for a long moment. Then I told him the truth. I hadn't planned to be fired. I hadn't planned revenge. Everything I'd done after was nothing more than instinct. The same instinct that had made me careful, precise, and quiet for 17 years. Robert studied me, then nodded. "Maybe that's exactly why you won." When he left, I looked out the window at the skyline. He was right. It wasn't strategy or ambition that had saved me. It was silence. The silence they mistook for weakness. The silence that let me watch, record, and wait until the time was right. They had collapsed under their own weight. I had simply stood still long enough to see it happen. The headlines eventually faded. Brian's guilty plea earned him a reduced sentence, but prison bars still waited. Daniel fought the charges in court, insisting he knew nothing, but the evidence was overwhelming. Jason Phillips was dragged back from Brazil in handcuffs. Meridian's reputation survived, but only because the board moved fast and let the public believe they had acted decisively. Few people knew the truth, that a quiet man they once discarded had forced their hand. Inside the company, things changed. Not overnight, but steadily. People walked softer in the hallways. Departments checked themselves before approving deals. I didn't need to bark orders or deliver speeches. A single question from me, one line in an email, was enough to freeze bad decisions in their tracks. Power didn't come from shouting. It came from silence, carefully applied. But with power came distance. Old colleagues who used to joke with me now avoided small talk. Even Andrea noticed. One night she asked if I missed being just the systems guy, the one nobody paid attention to. I told her the truth. Sometimes. Silence had been my armor before. Now it was my shadow. Still, I knew this was temporary. I wasn't building an empire. I was cleaning up a mess. Every new fraud I uncovered, every broken process I repaired, brought me closer to a decision I had been circling since the day Daniel fired me. Did I want to stay? Or had I already done what I came back to do? The answer began to form one afternoon when I walked past the old IT floor. My team was busy, faces lit by monitors, coffee cups scattered across desks. For the first time in months, I let myself smile. They were thriving without me hovering over their shoulders. Steven, now leading them, had found his rhythm. He didn't need me anymore. And that was the point. That night, I sat in my office long after the building had emptied. I thought about the last 17 years, about the way they had erased me with a single sentence. "We're eliminating your position." I thought about the 3 weeks of silence that followed, and how those weeks had reshaped everything. And I realized something. I didn't need Meridian anymore. I had already won. The next morning, I drafted my resignation. Not a long letter, not a speech. Just one line. "I've completed what I came back to do." I saved it, but didn't send it yet. Timing mattered. For 3 weeks, they had thought they buried me. For months, they had thought they owned me. But just like before, I wasn't leaving angry. I wasn't leaving broken. I was leaving quietly. And this time, the silence would be final. I didn't send the resignation right away. Timing was everything. And silence works best when it arrives at the moment of greatest impact. I waited, watched, and let events unfold. 2 weeks later, the board held their quarterly meeting. For the first time in years, Meridian reported clean numbers. No hidden vendors, no inflated invoices, no mysterious payments. The directors congratulated themselves, pretending they had always been vigilant. I sat at the far end of the table, saying nothing, watching them soak in their own relief. When the meeting ended, Robertson pulled me aside. He said the company owed me everything. He called me the reason Meridian had survived. He even hinted that they wanted me to take on a bigger role, perhaps COO, maybe even more. I listened. I nodded once. But inside, I already knew my answer. That night, back in my office, I opened the draft of my resignation. I added one sentence. I leave Meridian stronger than I found it, and free of the rot that almost destroyed it. Then I saved it again, unsent. One last piece was missing. The missing piece came faster than I expected. 3 days later, news broke that Daniel had finally confessed, throwing Phillips under the bus in exchange for a lighter deal. Reporters camped outside headquarters. Cameras rolled as employees slipped in and out of the building. The same company that had fired me without ceremony was now in the spotlight again, desperate to show its stability. That evening, I printed my resignation, placed it in an envelope, and slid it under the door of the interim CEO's office. No speeches, no warnings, just silence on paper. By the next morning, the news had leaked. Anonymous sources inside the company told reporters I had stepped down. Headlines spun it as a graceful exit. Some said I was retiring. Others called it a quiet protest. None of them knew the truth. The truth was simple. I had finished what I came back to do. I had dismantled the scheme, rebuilt the systems, and trained the next generation to carry it forward. Staying longer would only tie me again to a place that once betrayed me. When Andrea asked if I was sure, I told her yes. My voice was steady, my decision final. She didn't argue. She just nodded, the way she always did when she knew I was past the point of doubt. That evening, I drove past the headquarters one last time. The glass tower gleamed under the city lights. 17 years of my life were inside those walls, buried among servers, systems, and silent battles. But none of it belonged to me anymore. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove on, the road opening ahead, quiet and clear. Sometimes silence ends a chapter. Sometimes it begins the next one. Mine was about to begin. After I left Meridian, the silence followed me. Not the heavy kind that presses on your chest, but the kind that clears space. For the first time in decades, I woke without an alarm. No frantic emails, no system failures waiting for me before sunrise. Just mornings with coffee on the porch, Andrea by my side, and the sound of a neighborhood waking up. I had enough savings, enough pension, and more than enough peace of mind. The company I once thought defined me was now just another name in the business section, a place that had burned itself down and rebuilt in the ashes. People still tried to reach me, former colleagues asking advice, journalists chasing quotes, recruiters dangling offers. I answered almost none of them. My life wasn't about Meridian anymore. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Andrea asked if I regretted any of it. The 17 years, the betrayal, the quiet revenge. I thought for a long moment before answering. I told her no, because everything I had lost had made room for what I gained. They taught me the cost of loyalty, but they also taught me the power of silence. Sometimes I thought about Daniel, Brian, and Phillips, men who believed they were untouchable, men who mistook quiet for weakness. They had written me off with a single sentence, and 3 weeks later their empire began to crack. Not because I shouted, not because I fought in their way, but because I waited, watched, and let their own actions collapse the walls around them. I never celebrated their downfall. There was no toast, no victory lap, just the steady knowledge that justice, when done right, doesn't need applause. It only needs patience. Months later, I received a letter from Robert Chun. He thanked me, not just for saving the company, but for showing him how fragile power really is when built on lies. He said Meridian would never forget what I had done. I folded the letter once and placed it in a drawer. Recognition didn't matter. The work was finished. Andrea and I began traveling more. Small towns, quiet landscapes, places where no one cared about boardrooms or balance sheets. I picked up carpentry again, something I hadn't touched since my 20s. Building with my hands felt cleaner than building with systems. Each project ended with something tangible, something that couldn't be stolen or forged. Sometimes, when the evenings grew too quiet, I thought back to the moment Daniel fired me. The red light on my badge, the way he avoided my eyes, the way I answered with just 2 words, "I understand." They thought those words meant defeat. They were wrong. Silence had been my weapon. Silence had been my shield. Silence had been the reason Meridian collapsed from within while I walked away untouched. Some men fight with noise. Others fight with silence. And sometimes, silence wins. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.